On Christmas Eve in the quiet town of Fayetteville, a devastating house fire swallowed 5 children without a trace. Decades of silence followed until one shocking letter arrived, shattering 20 years of unanswered questions. What really happened that night? And could this shocking revelation finally unravel the mystery? Snow fell gently over Fayetteville, West Virginia on Christmas Eve 1945, blanketing the Sauter family's white clapboard house in a peaceful hush. Inside, George and Jenny Sauter's home buzzed with the excited energy of their children, 10 in all, as they prepared for Christmas morning. The older children begged to stay up later to play with toys they had received early, and Jenny, feeling the warmth of the holiday spirit, relented, despite her usual strictness about bedtime. It was a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A sharp noise startled Jenny awake just after midnight, something hitting the roof with a thud. She rose from bed, checked the house, and finding nothing amiss, returned to sleep beside her husband George. But at 1:30 a.m., the acrid smell of smoke pulled her violently from slumber. Her heart lurched as she spotted flames licking up the wall near the office. "Fire! George, wake up!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the quiet house. "The children! The children!" George leapt from bed, his mind racing to the unthinkable. Their 10 children were scattered throughout the house, some upstairs, some down. Through the thickening smoke, George and Jenny managed to locate John, 23, along with Marion and George Jr., and shepherded them outside into the biting December cold. 2-year-old Sylvia was carried safely out. But upstairs, where Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty slept, there was no response to their frantic calls. George tried desperately to reach the second floor, but the staircase was engulfed in flames. He ran outside to retrieve the ladder he always kept against the house, but it was inexplicably missing. In a desperate attempt, he tried to drive one of his coal trucks up to the house to climb onto the roof, but the engines wouldn't start despite having worked perfectly the day before. Water from the nearby creek might have helped, but the fire consumed the home with supernatural speed. As the family huddled in the snow, watching their home collapse into ash and embers, one horrifying truth emerged. 5 children had disappeared in the house fire on Christmas Eve. 5 children: Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, were nowhere to be found. "They must still be in there," George kept repeating, his voice hollow with shock as neighbors arrived. "They must be in there." But the fire chief, who arrived at 8 a.m. after the house had already burned to the foundation, delivered news that would set in motion one of America's most baffling mysteries. "We've found no bones." The days following the house fire carried the sharp edge of grief mixed with something rarely experienced in tragedy: uncertainty. Most families who lose loved ones in fires face the grim reality of remains. The Sauters faced emptiness. No traces of their 5 missing children were found in the ashes. Not a bone, not a button, nothing to suggest they had perished there at all. "It's not possible," F.J. Morris, the fire chief, had told George and Jenny when the ruins cooled enough for a proper search. "A fire, even one this hot, doesn't completely destroy human remains. There should be something." Jenny sat at the kitchen table of her sister's home where the surviving family had taken refuge, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. "Then where are they? Where are my babies, if they didn't die in that fire?" The official explanation came quickly. The children had been completely cremated in the intense heat. The death certificates listed fire as the cause of death. Case closed. But for George and Jenny Sauter, whose 5 children had disappeared in the house fire on Christmas Eve, the case was anything but closed. Too many things didn't add up. The missing ladder that always leaned against the house was later found thrown down an embankment. The trucks that wouldn't start had their wiring tampered with. The telephone lines to the house had been cut. And most disturbing of all, a man had been watching the children in the days before the fire, according to their daughter Marion. "Someone took them," George said one evening, weeks after the tragedy, his voice hardened with conviction. "Someone started that fire to take our children." The theory sounded like the desperate hope of grieving parents, but strange details continued to surface. A woman at a roadside diner claimed to have served breakfast to children matching the Sauter children's descriptions on Christmas morning, accompanied by adults speaking in Italian accents. A motel owner reported seeing the children in a car with West Virginia plates about a week after the fire. "People will say anything after a tragedy," the local sheriff dismissed when George brought him these accounts. "Folks want to help, so they convince themselves they've seen something." But George Sauter, an Italian immigrant who had built a successful trucking business through stubborn determination, refused to be dismissed. As 1945 turned into 1946, he and Jenny began their own investigation. They interviewed witnesses the police had overlooked, followed leads the fire marshal had ignored, and gradually constructed a theory that their children had been kidnapped, not killed. "My husband made enemies," Jenny confided to her sister. "He spoke against Mussolini back when that wasn't popular. There were threats." The Sodders' search intensified with each passing year. They hired private investigators who came and went, some finding promising leads that disappeared into dead ends, others simply disappearing with their money. The empty space at the dinner table where 5 children once sat became a physical representation of the hole in their lives, a constant reminder of the 5 kids who disappeared in the house fire on Christmas Eve, whose fate remained unknown. In 1952, 7 years after losing their children, George and Jenny Sodder made a bold move that demonstrated their unwavering belief. They erected a billboard at the edge of Fayetteville. It featured photographs of the 5 missing children, details about the fire, and offered a $5,000 reward for information. A small fortune at that time. Beneath it all was a question that burned more fiercely than any fire. What was their fate? The billboard became both a symbol of the Sodders' refusal to accept the official story and a lightning rod for controversy in Fayetteville. Some townspeople viewed it as a proper memorial. Others saw it as a morbid reminder of a tragedy best forgotten. For the surviving Sodder children, now growing into adulthood with the weight of their siblings' disappearance shaping their lives, it represented their parents' fierce love, a love that refused to surrender to comfortable lies. "People think we should move on," their son John said during a rare newspaper interview in the mid-1950s. "But how do you move on when you don't know what happened? How do you bury your brother or sister without a body? Without knowing?" Life continued its forward march despite the family's suspended grief. The surviving children married and had children of their own. George maintained his trucking business, though his heart wasn't in it anymore. Jenny kept a suitcase packed at all times, ready to travel at a moment's notice should news of her children surface anywhere in the country. Each Christmas Eve, the anniversary of the night when 5 kids disappeared in the house fire, the family gathered in solemn remembrance. They didn't exchange gifts. Instead, they shared memories of Maurice's laugh, Martha's singing, Louis's clever hands that could fix anything, little Jenny's way with animals, and Betty's bright curiosity. These stories became a ritual, keeping the missing children alive in their hearts. In 1966, George Bragg, a local writer researching unsolved West Virginia cases, approached the family about including their story in his book. The investigation he conducted stirred up forgotten witnesses and overlooked evidence. "The fire marshal who conducted the original investigation," Bragg told them during a tense interview at their modest new home, "resigned shortly after your case. Did you know that? And the evidence he collected, the piece of the supposed incendiary device, has conveniently disappeared from official records." This revelation hit George Sodder like a physical blow. "All these years," he said, his voice barely audible, "and they've been burying the truth along with my children." The publication of Bragg's book brought national attention back to the case that locals had tried to forget. Letters began arriving from across the country, some with legitimate information, others from self-proclaimed psychics or cruel pranksters seeking to exploit a family's pain. But none of these would compare to the shocking letter that arrived in the mail in 1968, 20 years after the family had adjusted their understanding of the timeline and began counting from the summer of 1948, when they officially lost hope of finding them alive through conventional means. The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday, bearing no return address, its Kentucky postmark the only clue to its origin. Jenny collected it with her usual mail, expecting nothing more than bills or perhaps a late Christmas card. When she opened it at the kitchen table, a single-page handwritten letter slipped out, along with a photograph that made her heart stop. "George!" Her trembling voice brought her husband running from the next room. "George, look at this!" The letter began without greeting or signature. "The children didn't die in the fire. They were taken while the house burned as a distraction. I've risked everything to send this. They are watching me and will know I've written to you. This is the only proof I dare send." Beneath these chilling words was the photograph, a young man in his early 30s with dark features and serious eyes. Despite the passage of 20 years, the face bore an unmistakable resemblance to their missing son. Jenny's hands shook violently as she turned over the photograph. Written on the back in unfamiliar handwriting were the words, "Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Elil boys." A 90,132 or 35. The kitchen fell silent as the implications settled over the family. Louis, their Louis, who would now be 32, might be alive. The shocking letter confirmed what they had suspected for 2 decades. The 5 kids who disappeared in the house fire on Christmas Eve had not perished after all. "It's him," Jenny whispered, touching the face in the photograph with trembling fingers. "George, it's our Louis." George studied the photograph, his weathered face unreadable. 20 years of hopes raised and dashed had taught him caution. "It could be," he finally admitted. "The eyes, they're the same." The letter's most disturbing detail, that the fire had been deliberately set as a distraction for a planned abduction, validated George's suspicions all along. Within days, they hired yet another private detective, instructing him to travel to Kentucky to track the letter's source. The cryptic message on the back of the photograph, particularly the reference to brother Frankie Sigwe, when no Sauter child had that name, suggested a coded message. Was Louis reaching out in the only way he could? Was he in danger? The questions multiplied faster than answers could be found. However, weeks passed with no word from the detective. When George called the Kentucky motel where the man had been staying, he discovered the detective had checked out after 2 days and never returned. Like the children themselves, the investigator had vanished without a trace. "They got to him," George said grimly over dinner one night. "Whoever took our children doesn't want to be found." The arrival of the shocking letter and photograph, and the subsequent disappearance of their investigator, reignited the case in the national press. A feature in Life magazine brought hundreds of new letters, including one from a woman who claimed to have been a nurse at a hospital where 5 badly burned children had been treated on Christmas Day, 1945. "The children were taken away by men in expensive suits," her letter claimed. "I was told never to speak of it." When Jenny tried to contact the woman, the letter was returned. No such person at this address. For the Sauters, the shocking letter represented both vindication and a new torment. If Louis was alive, what about the others? Had all 5 kids who disappeared in the house fire on Christmas Eve been taken? Were they alive somewhere? Perhaps unable to come home? Had the children been split up? The cryptic message. "I love brother Frankie. Elo boys." A 90,132 or 35 became an obsession for the family. They consulted cryptographers, linguists, and even former intelligence officers from the war. Some suggested it referenced a military serial number. Others thought it might be coordinates or an address. The Elo boys remained a complete mystery. "What if it's not a code at all?" their daughter Marion suggested one evening as the family pored over enlarged copies of the shocking letter and photograph. "What if they forced him to write nonsense to make us believe it was him?" The possibility that the letter might be an elaborate hoax designed to manipulate their grief was almost too painful to consider. But 20 years after their 5 kids disappeared in the house fire on Christmas Eve, the Sauters had learned to consider every possibility, no matter how heartbreaking. Sadly, George Sauter died in 1969, just 1 year after receiving the shocking letter and photograph, taking to his grave the anguish of never knowing what happened to his children. The mysterious communication had given him hope, but no closure. Before his death, he made his surviving children promise never to stop searching. Jenny honored that promise with fierce dedication. She wore black exclusively for the remainder of her life, a walking embodiment of mourning. The billboard with the 5 missing children's faces remained standing, weathering storms both literal and figurative, as Fayetteville residents periodically suggested it be taken down. "Not until I know," was always Jenny's response. "Not until I know what happened to my babies." The 1970s and 80s brought new investigative techniques and the emergence of organizations dedicated to finding missing children. Each advancement gave the Sauter family momentary hope, but the case remained stubbornly unsolved. The original fire scene had long been bulldozed and covered over with grass and wildflowers. George's attempt to soften the physical reminder of where 5 kids disappeared in the house fire on Christmas Eve. Sylvia Sauter Paxton, who had been only 2 years old when her siblings vanished, grew up in the shadow of the mystery. As her mother aged, Sylvia took up the mantle of the family's search. "I don't remember them," she admitted in a rare interview in the 1980s. "I was too young, but I grew up with their ghosts, with their empty beds and their pictures on the wall, and the stories my parents told. They're as real to me as any memory could be." When Jenny Sauter passed away in 1989, the billboard was finally taken down. But the search continued through Sylvia and her daughter, who became the keeper of the family's extensive archives. Boxes of correspondence, investigative reports, newspaper clippings, and theories that filled an entire room. In the decades since the family received that shocking letter 20 years after the disappearance, various journalists, authors, and amateur sleuths have tried to crack the case. Theories range from the children being taken by an Italian mafia organization retaliating against George for his anti-Mussolini stance, to a local family who couldn't have children of their own, to a child trafficking ring. The mystery of what truly happened to the 5 Sauter children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, remains one of America's most baffling unsolved cases. The fire that should have left remains but didn't, the evidence that disappeared, the witnesses who changed their stories, the private detective who vanished, and the shocking letter that arrived 20 years later, raising more questions than it answered. Could someone truly have orchestrated such a sinister plot, stealing 5 innocent lives under the guise of tragedy? What do you think happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sauter? Share your theories in the comments below. We'd love to hear your insights. We'll see you in the next mystery.